One.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Daily Objective, and today is a special episode. Razi said keep the intro under 45 minutes today. This is a big one. Hey everybody, welcome to the Daily
That's
Objective.
me.
Yep, and we're off to a great start. Now we're going to be talking about Israel, the vaccine, the Arab-Israeli conflict and concerns. A lot to get into today. But first, let me tell you, we are on Clubhouse. Please jump over to Clubhouse right after the show. That's the hot new app that all the kids are talking about. We're there after every episode, and we're there every day. Add Razi Ginsburg. That's Razi with a Z, Ginsburg with a Z, and he'll add you to the room. Also, consider becoming an Ayn Rand Center UK member. Get exclusive content, exclusive study groups with some great teachers in objectivism, and also you get to help this thing grow. Wouldn't that be nice to know you played a role in making the world a better place? And especially today, guys, please super chat us. We got to show this guest what we're made of. So we're going to be talking about Israel. There's a topic that never evokes any controversy. So here's what I've learned from the internet. I've learned that COVID doesn't really exist. I've learned that the vaccine is bad for you. Don't take it. And I've learned that the Jews are orchestrating everything to funnel money over to Israel, right? So why are a bunch of Israelis injecting one another with this vaccine to this virus? Shouldn't they be sending it all to the Palestinians? Well, we're going to get to the bottom of all of this if YouTube doesn't terminate the stream mid-sentence. I can't do it alone. First of all, let me introduce my co-host. This is a guy who life was good. He had no reason to get in trouble. What did he do a few years ago then? He went on Twitter and started speaking in defense of Israel. Why would anyone want to speak in defense of a country which, frankly, I've heard some bad things about? It's Mark Pellegrino.
Thank you, Rucka. Hey, I heard through the grapevine that you had COVID. Is that true?
You know, I don't know if I mentioned it on the show, but yes, I had COVID. I have tested negative. I'm very, very excited. And by the way, we've got a guest today who, when I told him last week that I had COVID, his immediate response was to complain that he couldn't get it himself. This is a guy who, like myself, was born in Israel, but we're, I think, from very different sides of town. I was raised very religious. I was what Ben Shapiro would call a real Jew. A real Jew. Spent my Saturdays in prayer, abstaining from electronic equipment. That's right. We're real Jews. We didn't drive off to the beach. Imagine spending your Sabbath at the beach with a bunch of people in two-piece bathing suits. I don't know how much lower than that you can sink. But
bathing suits? Bathing suits?
Well, you know, the bikinis as opposed to, you know, separate. Anyway, if you're wondering whose voice that is, it is the author of several books. He is the chairman of the board of the Ayn Rand Institute. And catch this, he's got a podcast on the internet, the Yaron Brooks Show. And he's here with us today. Very exciting. Please welcome Yaron Brook.
Next time you're in Israel, we're going to have to send you some of the nudist beaches where they don't know about bathing suits in Israel.
I'm looking forward to that. I haven't been there in over 20 years. Pretty crazy. I don't know if I'll be allowed back in. But anyway, what do you think about this? I mean, or what do you know about this? So are the Israelis hogging the vaccines? That's what I'm hearing. What am I missing?
The Israelis are hogging the vaccines. I'm not sure who they're hogging it from exactly, because remember, I guess you're implying that Arabs are not Israelis. But Arabs are actually Israeli citizens. The Israeli citizens who are Arabs have as much access to the vaccines as anybody else does. And the challenge and the reason you actually do have a lower vaccination rate among the Arab population in Israel. And the reason for that is the conspiracy theories, unfortunately, are rampant among the Arab population. Your commentary about COVID maybe not existing and about the vaccine being a conspiracy, unfortunately, both of those are rampant among the Arab population. So vaccination rates are lower in the Arab community. So there's actually a period a few months ago when the vaccines were first introduced in Israel, where the Arab villages would get a truckload of vaccines, and they would start vaccinating, but there was very little demand. So at the end of the day, they had a lot of vaccines that were spoiling, and they would have to be trashed. So people figured this out, and what you'd see is in the afternoon, all these non-Arabs, Jews in other words, driving to Arab villages to get their vaccines ahead of the line because that's better than having the vaccines trashed. So the challenge is not that there's any kind of discrimination going on. The challenge is that there are two communities within Israel where the vaccines are viewed as suspect. The Arab population and your old hunting grounds, the ultra-Orthodox Jewish population. So vaccination rates among the ultra-Orthodox Jews are very low, and among the Arabs. Now, some of this is changing because what's happened recently is with the arrival of, I think it's a South African variant of COVID into Israel, Arabs are getting sick. More Arab Israelis are getting sick. Suddenly, they're realizing COVID might be real. And vaccination rates over the last few weeks among the Arab population are going up. But again, this has much more to do with culture, ideas, what people's attitudes, and it has anything to do with any kind of discrimination.
Right.
So do you think Saturday Night Live should apologize for its quip, its little joke?
Yeah, it's clearly a kind of an anti-Semitic joke or an anti-Arab joke. You could actually read the joke either way. You could read it as the Jews are hogging it to keep it from the Arabs, or you could read it as the Arabs are too stupid to get vaccinated. Either way, it's an ugly joke and inappropriate.
I think what confuses people about this is like there's the Arabs living as Israeli citizens. There's about 1 million of those, and they're basically living as Israelis. And they
have full rights under Israeli law, right? And they vote and they have political representation, and they are Israeli citizens.
And there's a Supreme Court judge in Israel, or there was one at least, that was an Arab or is an Arab. And there's a Miss Israel in the pageant who is an Arab. But now that's one type of, I guess, Palestinian. But then there's the actual sort of neighboring territories, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which has its own leadership. Since George Bush told them to hold elections, they've elected their own governments, which I don't know if the re-election time has come around yet in the last 15 years. But now those guys, I think maybe when people are saying the Israelis have all the vaccines, they're keeping it away from the Palestinians. Maybe they're talking about the sort of neighboring territories.
Yeah, so there's something there, right? But again, the Saturday Night quote was about Israel. It wasn't about the Palestinian territories. Look, Gaza Strip, it's stunning to me, the whole attitude towards the Gaza Strip, right? Here's a area adjacent to Israel, obviously, and I can't remember the population, but it's very, very densely populated. But it's hostile to Israel. They launch missiles into Israel. They try to start fires in Israel by launching these balloons with fires that go into Israel and start fires. They clearly want to kill as many Israelis as possible. They build tunnels and they smuggle terrorists in to try to kill as many Israelis in. And yet, you have this hostile territory next to you. And Israel, you know that Israel supplies all the electricity to this area? Do you know that Israel provides them with water? So they're literally providing the energy for the Palestinians to be able to kill Israelis. They're providing them with electricity to make that possible. And then they bomb them once in a while. So the whole thing is only an altruist could fight a war like this. Now, it is true that they are a separate political entity. Now, the altruists in the world, in the global community, are demanding that Israel provide them with a vaccine, right? Provide this political entity that's hostile to Israel and kills Israeli at every opportunity. And indeed, they have. So there have been some shipments of vaccines from Israel into the Gaza Strip. But I consider that suicide and insanity. Let Egypt supply them. Let the Iranians supply them with vaccines. Why should Israel, who they are killing Israelis, this is a treasonous act, in my view, by the Israeli government to provide the Gaza Strip with vaccines. Now, in the West Bank, and we're getting into details, and I know this is stretching Americans' knowledge of geography and of kind of the details of these conflicts. But the West Bank is, again, partially governed by Israel, partially governed by this autonomous authority. It's more complicated there, given the fact that vaccines are only provided by government. There's no market in vaccines. You can't just go and buy them. Should Israel be providing vaccines to at least those people within the West Bank that are under its authority? Yes, I think they should. I mean, if you're occupying people, then you're supposed to protect their individual rights. But it's complicated because the whole situation there is incredibly complicated. And again, conspiracy theories, other reasons why Palestinians are not accepting vaccines even when offered. But Israel generally could have a different attitude towards Palestinians, both be tougher and be better at defending their rights at the same time, right? Tougher in terms of self-defense.
It's controversial, to put it very lightly, among the Palestinians in the territories to accept anything from Israel, like medical treatment or anything like that, or to sell.
Well, unless they're very sick, and then they're happy to accept it. Right.
Okay. Now, Mark, any questions or thoughts? Any comments on this whole topic? It's a bit of a big
I feel like I'm a fly on the wall. You guys are from the area, so as much as I've read about it, you guys lived it, and you guys know the situation on the ground much better than I.
But you say that skepticism is the biggest problem, and I sort of agree. And skeptics would say being from somewhere makes you biased, right? So the fact that we've been there, the skeptics might say, makes us too biased. You can only really be objective if you're completely indifferent and disinterested. A little bit of philosophical.
That's certainly the skeptics' take on things, but the skeptics are wrong as usual.
True.
Hey, but Yaron, I wanted to ask you, don't you think the anti-Semites would say, well, look, the Israelis control the water and electricity to these areas because it's a military advantage for them. Whenever the Palestinians start acting up, they turn off the electricity and water, and it serves their purposes.
No, I mean, the Palestinians could build an electricity plant. They could use the resources in the Gaza Strip. Everything Israel left in the Gaza Strip when it abandoned that area, when it withdrew from that area, all the infrastructure, the agricultural infrastructure, other infrastructure were basically all destroyed because they didn't want to have anything Israeli, right? They didn't want anything to be tainted by Israeli technology. So whatever state they're in terms of the tough conditions there are their fault. There's no reason they can't build a desalination plant. No reason they can't build an electric plant if they had the resources to do it. To get the resources to do it, they'd have to produce those resources. And they don't have a productive economy. They live off of handouts from other Arab countries. Those handouts primarily are used to buy weapons. If they use those handouts to buy things that are productive, maybe they'd have a higher standard of living. But my view is, look, this is an enemy to Israel. So it's not that Israel should shut off the electricity sometimes. To me, it's just bizarre that Israel doesn't shut off the electricity permanently. It's an enemy. These people are killing Israelis. So you either view them as an enemy or not. But it's this altruistic view that because they're suffering, because they're poor, because they don't have anything, even though they're trying to kill you, you've got to help them, you've got to protect them, you've got to give them this stuff. And it's absurd.
It would confuse past generations and past civilizations if you told them there's this one vibrant civilization with rule of law that's just supplying water and electricity and all these things to a neighboring territory that is actively firing at them. They would not understand. Only somebody who lives in the modern world, who has seen the effect of modern philosophy and various very misguided attempts to be moral. Now, I've learned a lot from your discussions, your lectures on this, Yaron. You had one that I recommend often, which I think was called The Rise and Fall of Israel, which talks about how Zionism from the start, back in Europe in the 19th century, the goal was to get away from persecution, but it never really had a clear positive that it was working towards. And that's always recipe for disaster. So to this very day, there's this kind of internal conflict within the Israelis. No one quite knows what exactly they're doing there. And something like objectivism, if it had existed when Zionism came about, and certainly if they were to embrace it now, could bring about not only safety for the Jews, which was the intent of founding the country to begin with, but also liberty and peace.
Absolutely. I mean, the best thing that could happen to the Palestinians would be their defeat. and because their defeat would lead them to be integrated into Israel. The defeat would mean ideological defeat, would mean them having to change their view of the world and be, adopt kind of a liberal, in the classical liberal sense, a mind frame. As long as they think or feel like they can win, they can stick to a relatively primitive, relatively anti-Western, relatively anti-liberal mindset, which hurts their own people. Israel imports a lot of workers from places like the Philippines, Thailand, and other places to do work in Israel that there's a vast Palestinian population right there that could do that work. Israel has a labor shortage, and that labor shortage could be taken care of with the Palestinians. What you need is to eliminate the threat, the physical threat that they pose. And the only way to eliminate that threat is by unequivocally making it clear to them that they cannot win. People don't fight for causes that they believe they will never win.
Yaron, let me ask you a question. Do you think that the latest rounds of peace treaties with Arab countries was a step in that direction, since they were decoupling from the Palestinian issue?
I think it all helps. I don't think it's as big a deal as many people make of it, primarily because these countries are fly-by-night banana republics, or not banana republics, but basically authoritarian regimes, right? You're signing a peace deal with a little dictator of the United Arab Emirates who is horrific. If you look at the individual rights record of these countries, it's just horrible. I mean, just try going on the internet and saying you're an atheist, and if you're a local, you'll get stoned to death. So it's these countries are not good countries that we're signing peace deals. I don't believe we should. So it's a marginal move in that direction. But the only way the Palestinians will ultimately be convinced of this is if they're crushed militarily, and it's not pleasant. I don't like advocating for this, but there's just no other way. Israel should reoccupy the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, completely take away all the weapons that they have, completely defang them politically and militarily, put together a long-term 20, 30-year plan for integrating them into Israeli society, and telling them the dream of a Palestinian state, or whatever it is, or the takeover of Israel is done, finished, will not be tolerated, and impose, and make that clear unequivocally. So it's not easy. It's painful. I don't think Israel has the moral confidence to do it. I don't think they have the stomach for it. But it's the only thing that'll do it fast. It is possible that you can just wait them out, that these peace deals and other things, just over time, the Palestinians just get exhausted of the struggle and just give up. I don't know.
After 50 or 60 years, it doesn't seem like that's going to happen. But
no.
Right? Are there any secular politicians in Israel that are advocating the one-state solution?
Yeah, they are. I couldn't come up with a name right now, but they are. But in Israeli society is basically accepted to a large extent. I mean, there's no real viable left in Israel. Israel's interesting politically, because when it comes to foreign policy and dealing with the Palestinians, there's no left. There's nobody who says, oh yeah, tomorrow we need to establish a Palestinian state, right? I mean, there might be one political party that says that, or two political parties, but they get no vote. They get very few votes. I'd say 80% of the Jewish population is basically under the view of there's no way a two-state solution can work today. We don't know how a one-state solution can ever work, so we're just going to evade and live with the status quo, and the status quo is good enough for us. And we'll build a wall, or we'll pretend the problem will go away. And it's mass delusion and mass evasion. But they're not willing to comprehend what a one-state solution looks like. But they also all know that a two-state solution right now would not work, is not doable. So they pretend it's not a problem. I mean, my parents are like that. Everybody's like that, right? Everybody in Israel is like that.
Yeah, so Israel really is a microcosm of Western civilization in a number of ways. I mean, the way that it's seen by people tends to reflect how people see the West. And the way Israel sort of blames itself for everything is very Western, unfortunately. It should not be. It's not inherent in the Western values, but it reflects the sort of philosophical turns that intellectuals have taken. So just as American intellectuals hate America, similarly, in my understanding, Israeli intellectuals they sort of led the way in blaming Israel for all the problems
Absolutely.
around them and for likening Israel to Nazi Germany. In my understanding, that kind of came from Israeli universities. But in general, as in any Western country, Israeli intellectuals are anti-Israel because they hate everything that makes Israel good. Relative capitalism, relative individualism, and a respect for reason.
Yeah, I mean, the founding intellectuals of Israel, the intellectuals that were at the universities in Israel when the country was founded in 1948, were basically all neo-Kantians. And I get into this in that talk you mentioned about the rise and fall of the state of Israel, or the rise and decline of the state of Israel. It hasn't fallen. But it is, so I'm, one second, let me just change this. So it is the case that Israeli intellectuals are the same. I mean, there's even a kind of a woke culture in Israel. It's not quite as bad as America, but Israel usually lags by 5 years. Any American trend usually becomes trendy in Israel a few years later, although with the internet, it tends to happen faster. The left in Israel is very similar to the left in the United States, with the exception of it's more realistic about foreign policy. But it's adopted this guilt, this idea of guilt. It's adopted this idea of they're to blame for everything, and you do see Israeli intellectuals writing books and novels and everything where Israel is the villain and Israel is the problem in the Middle East.
Yeah, when you mentioned the 5-year lag in Israel, that reminded me of growing up over there. Now, I think I entered Israel around the time you left. I was born in '87, and all the TV shows were 5 years behind. Everything, all the movies would show up late. So that definitely
You were
brought
born
back some
the
memories.
year I left Israel. That is interesting.
I like to say I took over where you left off.
Took over where I left off.
But yeah, so I saw the peace deals, the handshake with Yasser Arafat. As a kid, I was like, so what's the point of this if it's not real peace? And no one had an answer then, just like no one has an answer now. So it really was as stupid as it looked. You can't explain it to a child because a child understands.
You were 6 or 7, right?
I was about. Yeah.
I remember calling my parents up and saying, "This is a disaster. The terrorism will only increase. What have you done?" And terrorism did increase right after that and continued through the second intifada in the early 2000s. And even my parents, who are fairly left, are much more realists when it comes to the whole Palestinian issue than they used to be. The facts on the ground are what they are. And if you lived through the 90s and 2000s, where Israel basically gave everything up, it withdrew from Gaza, it signed a peace deal with Yasser Arafat, it did all these things, and it was rewarded with basically blood, spilt everywhere on buses that I used to travel as a kid on, in the middle of Tel Aviv, in the shopping districts, in restaurants. And that people have forgotten what the early 2000s were like for a period of 2-3 years, and how little support Israel got from the rest of the world, including from the Bush administration, during that period to resolve that second intifada. People don't seem to care. They don't. It doesn't seem to have any impact, and they've forgotten that, and they view Palestinians as, this peaceful people who are being oppressed by the Israelis, when that is not the reality. Now, that's not to say Israel hasn't made a lot of mistakes, and it has, and it's treated the Palestinians badly on occasion, and it's treated its own Israeli Arabs badly on occasion. And I'm a huge critic of Israel when it comes to its socialist policies and its economic policies and the same kind of stuff that the United States has. But in the big picture, when you compare, there is no comparison. Israel's in the right here in the broad sense. Not to say everything it does is good.
Yeah, like every other Western country, it's got a lot of work cut out for it, and philosophy is
Well, that's
the
a
way.
very white racist thing to say. Western, West. You know,
One of the unfortunate things of the last few years, in all seriousness, is that the alt-right and all these new right Trump fans, who at this point they think Trump, many of them, they think Trump is way too, tame for what they're trying to accomplish. They've tried to appropriate Western to mean, a group of people, a family of people with no relation to philosophy or values, chosen values. So that's what we're trying to fight for here at the Ayn Rand Center UK. So in back to the vaccine, to wrap this up, is it basically what they call a nothing burger? There's really nothing to see here, folks. Anyone in Israel who wants the vaccine, whether they're Jewish or Arab, makes no difference. They have the same access.
Absolutely. I mean, I just read a story where they interview a lot of Arab doctors in hospitals, either hospitals in mixed cities or in Arab cities, and they're all basically saying the same thing, that the challenge is to convince Arabs to come and get the vaccine. The communities in the U.S., a variety of different communities in the U.S. that are anti-vax for a variety of different reasons, and they have a variety of different skin colors sometimes associated with them. There are communities within the black community, the communities within the white community that don't want to get vaccinated. And it's not the lack of availability of vaccines, it's that they don't want to get the vaccine. And unfortunately, that is true in some Arab communities. And again, not to generalize, what was the last number I saw? About 40%, or was it 30%? Somewhere between 30 to 40% of Arabs in Israel have already been vaccinated. I wish you could say the same thing about Californians. I wish you could say the same thing about Puerto Ricans. I wish you could say the same thing about any state in the United States. Which state has a 30 to 40% vaccination rate? And primarily among the elderly in the Arab communities in Israel, the vaccination rates are quite high. At least they've got one shot, which all the studies are now showing is a big advantage. So no, I don't think it's an issue. The bigger issue, of course, with the vaccination is, why is the government even involved in it? That's the issue. Now, in Israel, medicine is socialized to a large extent, so you expect it, but why is the government even involved in it? And what would be the vaccination rate, imagine, everywhere in the world if the government wasn't involved in it?
Well, this is kind of a last-minute can of worms, and then we really do need to wrap this up. But I know a lot of the aforementioned alt-right types, one of their kind of talking points is to say that, like, America sends all this money to Israel, and then Israel, they have socialized medicine, while Americans are not getting the treatment they need. So, real quick, can of worms open. How would you respond to these guys probably in your chat room currently?
First, I'd say, there are a few of them in the chat room. I would say that America shouldn't send a dime to Israel unless it's related to defense technology, which the United States benefits from directly. So unless it's an investment in defense, I don't think Israel needs the money. I think it's like welfare. It makes Israel a less prosperous country because it represses movement towards more free markets because they've got Uncle Sam sending them checks. But of all the countries in the world that the United States gives money to, and it gives to Egypt just as much as it gives to Israel and to a lot of other countries, Israel's probably the most virtuous of all those countries, and the one that the United States gets the most out of the money. So stop foreign aid. I'm all with that. The sad thing is that those alt-right would like to bring socialized medicine into the United States. They'd like to use their money to create socialized medicine here, or at least for some populations in the United States, they would like to have socialized medicine.
Yeah, let's have you back and talk about the new right and the alt-right, and by that time they'll probably morph into something even more horrific. But that's for another day. Thank you, everybody, for watching. We got some super chats. Well, we didn't even have time to read. This was such a great episode. And thank you, Mark. Thank you, Yaron.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. This was fun.
It was a lot of fun. We're about to jump over to Clubhouse, everybody. Join us there. And please consider becoming an Ayn Rand Center UK member. You get exclusive content, study groups with some great objectivist thinkers, and best of all, you get to save the world at a time when, guys, if you think Israel's bad, wait till you see what the whole world looks like if we don't act now. All right. Thank you and goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.